Her voice dropped to a whisper. That was the moment I knew my sister had done something I could not undo with a phone call or a polite conversation. My 8-year-old daughter Camille came home on the second day at her new school and told me, in that small, careful voice children use when they're not sure if they're in trouble, that her Aunt Renata had talked to the principal, had gone there before us, had said things. And the way Camille said it, she said I was bad, Mama, with her chin tucked down and her eyes doing that searching thing where she was trying to read my face before committing to a feeling, told me everything I needed to know about how it had landed on her. I did not show her what moved through me in that moment. I smiled, I smoothed her hair back. I told her she was not bad. She had never been bad, that some adults sometimes made mistakes. I gave her dinner and a bath and sat beside her bed until she fell asleep. And then I stood in the hallway of our new apartment, the one we had moved into 11 days earlier after the divorce was finalized, and I let myself feel it fully for exactly 60 seconds. After that, I made 2 phone calls and started building something my sister had no idea was coming. Some people who hear this story say I went too far in the end. I want you to hear everything first. Then I want you to tell me what you would have done. If you're watching this and you have a child, and someone who was supposed to love that child used them as a weapon, you already know there is no version of this where you stay quiet. There is no version where you let it stand. There is only what you do next and whether you do it carefully. I was careful. Let me tell you how we got here. My name is Nora Scott. I am 38 years old. I have one daughter, Camille, who just turned 8 in February. Her father, my ex-husband Dario Fuentes, and I separated 14 months before the events I am about to describe, and the divorce was finalized 6 weeks before we moved to the new school district. We moved because the apartment we had been renting was 40 minutes from my office and I needed something closer. That is the whole reason for the move. Not to escape anyone, not to hide, just geography and a lease that had run out. My sister's name is Renata Scott. She is 43. We share a father, we do not share a mother. Our father, Gerald Scott, married my mother when Renata was 11 years old, which means I grew up in a house where I was the younger, wanted from the beginning child, and Renata was the older child from his first marriage who came every other weekend and some holidays. She was not cruel to me when we were children. I want to be accurate about that. She was not cruel. She was careful, the way people are careful around something they have decided is a threat, but are not yet ready to confront directly. She watched me, she cataloged things, and as we got older and the calculus of what my father would leave behind became more concrete in her mind, that watchfulness sharpened into something else. Our father passed away 4 years ago. He left a house and some savings and a small investment property in the same suburb where I grew up. The will was not complicated. He split everything equally between us, which Renata had expected and accepted publicly, though what she said privately was a different matter entirely. She told our aunt, my father's sister, that it should have gone to her entirely because she had spent more time caring for him in the last years of his life, which was partially true. She had been nearby while I was in a different city building my career. What she did not say, to our aunt or to anyone, was that I had been sending money home every month for 3 years to cover the parts of his care that were not covered by insurance. I had never mentioned this because it was not something I needed credit for. He was my father. The investment property sat in both our names for about 18 months after he died. Then Renata proposed we sell it. I agreed. We split the proceeds. That should have been the end of any financial entanglement between us. It mostly was, except that Renata had a way of treating any asset I had that she could see or estimate as something she deserved to have input on. When I bought a car she had not approved of, she commented on it. When I was promoted and the news circulated in the family, she asked my mother, not me, whether I was being smart about saving. When I put together a college fund for Camille, opened a 529 account and began making regular contributions from the moment Camille was born, Renata found out through my mother and told her it was, and I am quoting directly here, a little premature for someone in her financial situation. Camille was 3 months old when Renata said that. My financial situation at that point, which Renata knew nothing about because I had not told her and had no obligation to, was that I had been managing a regional sales territory for a medical equipment company for 4 years, had been promoted twice, and was earning a salary that was comfortable enough that I had also quietly been contributing to my own retirement account through a financial advisor named Thomas Ackerfer, who I had first met at a professional networking event and who had been helping me build something methodical and steady for going on 6 years. I did not broadcast any of this. My family was not entitled to my financial statements, but I was not struggling. I had never been struggling in the way they assumed. That is the thing about assumptions. They are self-sealing. Once someone has decided what you are, Every piece of evidence gets routed through that filter. I drove a sensible car because I was being financially responsible, but they read it as I could not afford better. I lived in a rented apartment instead of rushing to buy property because I was strategic about timing, but they read it as I had not yet figured out how to be an adult. My mother, who loved me, genuinely loved me, had still absorbed enough of Renata's framing over the years that she occasionally said things like, "You know you can always come to us if things get tight." In a tone that made me understand, she did not believe things were not already tight. The first time this dynamic became something I could not dismiss as minor was at a family dinner, roughly 3 years after my father died. Renata had started dating a man named Philip Strand, who had a good deal of money from commercial real estate, and who Renata had immediately positioned as evidence of her own judgment and taste. He was pleasant enough. He asked about my work the way people ask about work when they are being polite but expect a short answer. I gave him a short answer. Renata filled in behind me with, "She's in sales," in the exact tone a person uses when they are saying, "She is in sales," but meaning, she did not find anything better. Philip nodded and moved on. That night I sat with the specific feeling that produces for a moment, the flattening. The way someone can take something real about your life, something you have built with actual effort across actual years, and reduce it to a category that carries just enough truth to stick and just enough condescension to sting. I had felt it before with Renata. I would feel it again, but that particular night I had signed a contract with a new regional account 3 days earlier that was worth $160,000 in commission over 18 months. I did not say this. I smiled and asked Philip about his properties. What I did do was call Thomas Ackefer on my drive home and tell him I wanted to accelerate my contributions for the next quarter. There was something about that dinner that clarified my direction. I was not angry exactly. I was focused. That was the moment I understood what Renata actually needed from me. She needed me to be smaller than her, not because she was malicious in the way people think of malice, but because the size of what she had decided she was dependent on other people not taking up too much space. I had filed away a dozen moments like that one by then, not out of bitterness, out of precision. What I did not know was that she was already planning something that would take the space she had carved out of my life and fill it entirely. The second incident that matters happened about a year later, and it involved Camille directly for the first time. Camille had just turned 4. She was in a preschool program that had identified her as having exceptional verbal reasoning and had enrolled her in an extended language enrichment program offered within the same building. It was not a big thing in my mind. She was 4 and she liked talking, and the teachers had found a way to channel that. But to my mother, it was something to discuss at a family lunch. And at that lunch, Renata said, with the particular brightness that signals a prepared comment, that she hoped I was not one of those parents who pushed their children too hard too young, because the research was very clear about the psychological costs of early pressure. Camille was sitting 2 feet away, eating a roll. I told Renata calmly that Camille had enrolled herself in the sense that she had asked to stay for the extra sessions and I had let her, and that we were not doing anything requiring a research citation. Renata smiled the smile that means she has scored a point and let it go. My mother changed the subject. What I held on to from that moment was not the comment. It was the fact that Renata had made it in front of Camille. That was a choice. Subtle enough to explain away, deliberate enough to be intentional. She had wanted Camille to hear something that positioned me as a possibly problematic parent. I did not know why yet. I had a theory that it was habit, that Renata simply could not be in a room where I had something she considered worth undermining without doing something about it. But I kept the observation. People like Renata only feel powerful when someone nearby feels uncertain. And that lunch was the second time she had chosen to make Camille the instrument. That was the second incident. I let it go, for a while. The third incident was the one that told me exactly what I was dealing with and made everything that followed not just justified but necessary. This happened 8 months before the move, so roughly 14 months before the events at the school. Dario and I were in the early stages of the separation, not yet divorced, still figuring out what the practical arrangement would look like. It was a stressful period. I was managing Camille's emotional state through it, managing my own, managing the logistics of a household reconfiguring itself, and also managing my job, which did not pause for any of it. Camille had been doing art at school. She had always done art. She had this portfolio, a physical one with a thick cardboard cover that her teacher had been helping her build for 2 years. 32 pieces in it. Drawings, mixed media things, some collages she was very proud of. Her teacher had told me at a parent conference that the portfolio was the kind of thing worth keeping because it documented a developmental arc in a child's creative thinking and would be meaningful to look back on. I kept the portfolio in a flat drawer in the hallway of the old apartment. I mention this only to explain that it was stored at home, not at school, not in a box, not hidden. It was in a drawer where it lived because that was where Camille had put it and where it had always been. Renata came to the apartment twice during the period of the separation. Once to drop off some things that had been stored at my father's old house. Once to have coffee when she said she wanted to check on me. I do not know when she saw the portfolio or whether she had been looking for it specifically. What I know is what I found. I'm going to come back to this. First, I need you to understand what I built during the years between my father's death and the morning everything came into view, because without that, the rest of this story does not make the sense it should. After Dario and I separated, I made an appointment with a family law attorney named Claudia Renner, whose name had come to me through a colleague at work who had been through a difficult custody arrangement 2 years prior. I want to be clear about why I'm mentioning Claudia. I am mentioning her because what she said in that first meeting on a Tuesday in late November, 3 years ago now, changed the architecture of every decision I made after that. She told me that documentation was protection. Not for any dramatic reason, just procedurally. She said the people who came to her in crisis were always the ones who had no records. The people who came to her with options were always the ones who did. I went home and I started keeping records of everything. Not obsessively. Not in a way that structured my daily life around it, but in a practical way, the way you would if someone told you something you already suspected but had not yet made into a habit. I kept a running log in a notes application on my phone, dates, specific quotes when I remembered them, interactions that felt worth noting. I did not know what I was building toward. I hoped I was building toward nothing, but I kept the log. The 529 account for Camille I had opened when she was born. By the time of the events at the school, it held $67,000, growing quietly in the background of everything else, managed by Thomas, reviewed every quarter, never touched. That was not for Renata. That was not for Dario. That was for Camille, and it existed regardless of what anyone thought about my financial situation or my timing. My retirement savings at the same point were in a different instrument, also with Thomas, also not something I discussed with my family. My mother knew I had savings, in the vague general sense. She did not know the specifics. I did not share them because they were mine, and because sharing them would have produced exactly the kind of commentary from Renata that every other financial decision had produced. What my family knew about me at the point where this story accelerates: I worked in medical equipment sales. I lived in a nice enough rented apartment. I drove a 4-year-old car. I was going through a divorce. They knew about Camille's school, her age, her art. What they did not know, the 529 account, the retirement savings, the detailed log I had been keeping for 3 years. The fact that Claudia Renner's name was in my phone under F for family law and that I had spoken to her 4 times, most recently 9 weeks before the move. The move itself was the first visible change they registered. A new school district, a new apartment, new territory for me, which meant new territory for Renata's assumptions. And I think that is what triggered what she did. Not malice with a plan, malice from disruption. She had a sense of what I was and where I stood, and the move shook it loose, and she reached for the nearest way to reestablish her position. She reached for my daughter's school. Now let me tell you about the portfolio, because this is where the story changes from something I could have absorbed into something I could not. When Camille came home on the second day and told me what her Aunt Renata had said to the principal, I did not show her my reaction. I told you that. I got her through the evening. Then I made 2 calls. The first was to the school, where I spoke with a woman in the administrative office who confirmed, with notable discomfort, that a concern had been raised by a family member prior to Camille's enrollment regarding behavioral patterns. She said the file had been flagged. She said the flag was being reviewed but had not yet been removed. I asked for everything in writing and she agreed to send it the following morning. The second call was to Claudia Renner's office. I left a message. Then I went into Renata's room. I say Renata's room because at that point, Renata had a room in my mother's house, where I had been staying for a period of about a week and a half between leases, the overlap between the old apartment and the new one. This is why she had access to the same space as me. We were temporarily in the same house. I had the portfolio with me because it had been in the things I moved out of the old apartment, boxed with some of Camille's school materials. It was in the room I was using, or it should have been. When I went to find it that night, after Camille was asleep, it was not where I had put it. I checked the box. I checked the flat shelf inside the closet where I had stacked the school materials. I went through every surface in the room twice. Then I stood very still for a moment and thought about what Renata's presence in that house meant, about what might have happened. I went to Renata's room. She was not home. Her door was not locked. I opened it. The portfolio was on her floor. Open. 32 pieces laid out in a rough grid across the carpet, each one torn, not damaged from handling. Torn deliberately, with a kind of methodical attention that required effort. The bigger pieces had been folded first and then ripped along the fold lines. The smaller pieces had been torn across the middle. Every single one. I stood in the doorway for long enough to take in the full scope of what I was looking at. Then I went to my room, got my phone, and came back and photographed every piece. I photographed the portfolio cover. I photographed the room to establish context. I photographed the damage on each individual piece in sequence, 32 images. Then I gathered every piece carefully, put them back in the portfolio, and took the portfolio to my room. I did not confront Renata that night. I know some people will find that strange. But I had been keeping a log for 3 years because Claudia Renner had told me documentation was protection, and I had just photographed evidence of something that was not a misunderstanding, or a slight, or a petty comment at a family lunch. This was destruction of a child's property. This was calculated, and I was not going to spend the only advantage I had in a hallway argument in the middle of the night. The next morning, I sent everything to the school board. Claudia had called me back by 8 in the morning, and I told her what I had. She told me to send the photographs, a written account of the timeline, and the information about the behavioral flag on Camille's file to the school board in writing before the close of business that day. I did all of this from the parking lot of a coffee shop 2 blocks from my mother's house, while Camille ate breakfast inside with my mother, who did not know what had happened. The email I sent to the school board contained the photographs, a timeline I wrote out in full from memory, including dates, and the fact of Renata's 2 visits to my old apartment and her access to my temporary room at my mother's house. A copy of the administrative confirmation from the school that a behavioral concern had been raised prior to enrollment. And a letter requesting immediate removal of the flag from Camille's file, and a written account of exactly what had been communicated to the principal and by whom. I copied Claudia on everything. Then I sent Claudia a separate note confirming the 3-year log existed and was available and asking her whether I was at the threshold for anything she had discussed with me in our last meeting. She said she would need to review, but that based on what I was describing, we should meet within the week. After I sent the emails, I sat in that parking lot for a while. The morning was gray and cold for the time of year, and the coffee was not good, and none of that mattered at all. I thought about Camille laying out her portfolio on the floor of the new school's library during free time, showing another child something she had made, and the way she still sometimes did that, offered her work without reservation to whoever was nearby, with that openness that was specific to her, and that I had spent 8 years trying to protect. Then I thought about Renata on the floor of her room, systematically folding and tearing 32 pieces of a child's work, one by one, with enough focus and patience to get through all of them. And I drove back to my mother's house, walked in, said good morning to Camille and my mother, poured myself a glass of water, and when my mother went to refill her coffee and Camille went to put on her shoes for school, I called my sister. Her phone rang 3 times. Then she picked up, and I said her name. And there was a pause, and her voice dropped to a whisper. That pause before she said anything told me she knew why I was calling. She did not say hello normally. She did not have the brightness of someone unaware. She said very quietly, Nora, just my name, like a warning to herself. I had not planned the exact words. I had planned the intention, which was not to yell, not to accuse in a way she could deflect, but to tell her clearly and specifically what I knew, what I had already done about it, and what was going to happen next regardless of her response. I had learned from Claudia that the most legally useful thing you can do in a confrontation with someone who has behaved the way Renata had behaved is to state facts and let them respond. So I stated facts. I told her I had found the portfolio. I told her I had photographed it in her room. I told her I had contacted the school board. I told her Claudia Renner was involved. And then I said, I want you to understand that Camille's file at that school will be corrected, and I want you to understand that everything that follows from this is a direct result of what you did. She was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. Then she said, still in that lowered voice, I was trying to help. I did not respond to that immediately. I let it sit. Because what it told me was that she had a prepared justification ready, which meant she had been thinking about what to say if I found out, which meant she had known what she was doing when she did it. I was not surprised, but I needed a moment for the full weight of it to settle into the record of things I now knew for certain. The morning outside my mother's kitchen window was brightening. Somewhere upstairs, Camille was putting on her shoes. I had a meeting with Claudia scheduled for 5 days from that moment. I had $67,000 in a 529 account that my sister had never once asked about and did not know existed. I had a 3-year log. I had 32 photographs. Renata thought she had disrupted something. She had no idea what she had actually started. The school board responded in writing by the following Monday. The email came to me at 6:41 in the morning while I was making Camille's lunch, and I stood at the kitchen counter and went through it twice before I let myself respond to it internally. They had reviewed my submission. They had spoken with the principal, whose name was Dr. Lorna Vasquez, a woman I had not yet met in person, but who had apparently received Renata's information in a brief hallway conversation before Camille's official enrollment, framed as a concerned family member offering context. Dr. Vasquez had noted the concern in the file with the best intentions and the worst information. The board's email was careful and institutional, and said, in the language of careful institutional emails, that the flag had been removed, that Camille's record showed no documented behavioral concerns, and that the school was committed to ensuring her transition was positive and supported. They also noted, in a sentence that was doing more work than it appeared to be doing, that they had requested clarification from the family member who had provided the original information. I forwarded the email to Claudia Renner before I finished my coffee. Camille went to school that morning and came home talking about a girl in her class named B who had a collection of erasers shaped like food, and whether I thought you could find one shaped like a taco, and whether I would help her start her own collection. She had not mentioned the principal again since that first night. Children that age have a remarkable capacity to file something in the category of adult problem, not mine, and move on if you let them. I had let her. She was already moving, but I was not done. Here is what I want you to understand about the 5 days between that Monday email and the Saturday afternoon at my mother's house that changed everything. I was not sitting in quiet triumph. I was preparing. Claudia and I met on Wednesday morning at her office, a ground floor suite in a building near the courthouse that always smelled like recycled air and the particular quiet of rooms where serious things are decided. I brought the log. 3 years of it transferred from my phone to a printed document that was 41 pages long, because Claudia had told me once that printed records carry a different weight in a room than a phone screen. I brought the 32 photographs. I brought the written confirmation from the school board. Claudia reviewed all of it across the table from me with a legal pad and a pen and the focused stillness of someone who is building a structure in their head as they go. When she finished, she put her pen down and looked at me. The photographs establish intentional destruction of property belonging to a child, she said. The school communication establishes a deliberate attempt to misrepresent that child's behavioral history to an educational institution prior to enrollment. Taken together, these are not a family dispute. These are actionable. I asked her what actionable meant in practical terms. She told me. I drove home with a clarity that was not about anger. It was more architectural than that. I knew what the structure was. I knew what needed to go where. I had the materials. And I knew that the Saturday lunch at my mother's house, which my mother had been planning for 2 weeks in celebration of nothing specific other than the fact that spring had arrived and she liked feeding people, was going to be the moment I chose because it was the moment where all the relevant people would be in the same room. Renata would be there, my mother. My mother's sister, my Aunt Dolores, who was the family's long memory keeper and who had known about the investment property division and my father's care, and all the history that surrounded it. My cousin Javier, Dolores' son, who had always been neutral in the way middle children of adjacent families are neutral, not cold but not committed. And Philip Strand, Renata's boyfriend, who had been coming to family events for 2 years, and who Renata had recently begun referencing as we, in a way that signaled she was considering him a permanent fixture. I called Thomas Aka for Thursday morning and told him I would likely need documentation of the 529 account and the retirement instruments in a form that could be presented to a non-financial audience. He understood without my needing to over-explain. He had been managing my money for 6 years. He knew what I was capable of when I had decided something. Saturday arrived the way consequential days sometimes arrive, which is quietly, without ceremony, as if nothing has been assigned to them. The morning was warm. I dressed Camille in a yellow dress she liked because it had pockets, dropped her at Dario's for the afternoon since this was his weekend, and since I had decided she did not need to be present for what was coming, and then I drove to my mother's house with a folder in my bag. My mother's house on a Saturday afternoon in April smelled like something roasting in the oven, and the particular sound of her old radio playing in the kitchen. A station she had been listening to since before I was born that played music she described as classics, and I described as background noise for thinking. Dolers was already there when I arrived, seated at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea, talking about a neighbor's fence dispute with the focused investment of someone for whom neighborhood politics are a genuine leisure activity. She patted my arm when I came in and asked about Camille, and I told her Camille was with her dad and doing well, and Dolers said she was glad and meant it. My mother was at the stove. She turned when I came in and smiled with the specific warmth she had always managed to produce regardless of what else was happening in her life, which was one of the things about her I found both admirable and, in the context of this particular situation, complicated. Her ability to hold the room in warmth had sometimes meant she held the room in warmth regardless of whether the room deserved it. Renata's on her way, she said. She's bringing that dip she made last time. Okay, I said. I put my bag on the chair near the door and went to help with the salad. Renata arrived 23 minutes later with Philip and the dip, which was a layered thing in a glass bowl that she had been making for family gatherings for the last several years, and which everyone complimented because it was genuinely good and also because it was the kind of thing Renata received well. She came in with the particular energy she brought to rooms where she expected to be the organizing force, that forward leaning attention that surveyed the space and assigned everyone a position. She kissed my mother's cheek. She set the bowl on the counter. She looked at me and her eyes did something careful and quick, a recalibration before she smiled. Nora. Her voice was level, socially correct, nothing in it that would signal to anyone else what was moving underneath. Renata. I matched her register exactly. Philip offered his hand to Dolers, who had not met him before, and went through the pleasantries of a man comfortable in unfamiliar rooms. Javier arrived 10 minutes after that, a little hurried, with a bottle of wine and an apology about parking. The table was set. The food came out. We all sat down. For 40 minutes, it was a normal family lunch. The fence dispute. A new story Javier had seen, whether my mother's garden was going to survive the late frost 2 weeks earlier. Philip talked about a property he was looking at in a neighboring county, and Renata listened with the half smile of someone who has already heard the details and is enjoying the audience's reaction. My mother refilled glasses. Dolers made a comment about a relative nobody had seen in 2 years. I ate and answered when spoken to and watched. Renata was waiting for something. I could see it in the way she was holding herself, the particular quality of her attention when it turned toward me, like a person listening for a sound just outside the range of normal hearing. She had not said anything about the school. She had not said anything about the portfolio. She was waiting to see what I would do, which meant she had assessed her position and concluded she was still in it. That assessment was the last miscalculation she made. It was Dolers, of all people, who gave me the opening. She looked at me between bites and asked, in the comfortable way of a woman who has known someone their whole life, "How is the new school? Camille settling in all right?" I put my fork down without rushing. I let the question sit for the natural beat of someone considering an answer. Then I said, "She is now, yes." There was a complication at the start. Someone contacted the principal before we enrolled and told them Camille had behavioral problems that weren't in any of her records. The table did not do anything dramatic. That is the thing about real moments, they do not perform themselves. What happened was this: Doller's expression shifted into the specific alert stillness of a woman who has been around long enough to recognize when a sentence has two layers. My mother's hand stopped in the motion of reaching for the bread. Javier looked up from his plate. Philip, who had been mid-sentence about his property, stopped talking, and Renata very carefully set her fork down. "That must have been stressful," Dollar said, meaning, "Tell me more." It was. Camille came home the second day and told me her aunt had warned the principal she was bad. I let that land for exactly 2 seconds. So I called the school. They confirmed a family member had been there before our enrollment and had raised concerns about behavioral patterns. There was nothing in any of her records from her previous school to support any of it. The flag has been removed, and the school board has it in writing. My mother's hand was still suspended above the bread basket. She had not completed the movement. She looked at me, and then at Renata, and then back at me, and what was in her face was a particular kind of pain that comes from loving two people who are in a conflict you cannot resolve by loving them harder. Renata picked up her fork again. Her voice came out smooth and reasonable. I was concerned. Camille had been going through a difficult period with the divorce, and I thought the school should be aware of the context. You told them she had behavioral problems. I was not raising my voice. I did not need to. I told them she had been having a hard time adjusting. That's different. Javier had stopped eating entirely. Philip was looking at the window. The school board's written summary of what was communicated, I said, reaching for my bag on the chair beside me, uses the phrase behavioral concerns. That phrase came from somewhere. I took out the folder and opened it and set the school board's email on the table, printed, facing her. Renata looked at it, a beat. Then she looked at me, and there was something in that look that I had not seen from her before. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like the recognition that the room she had thought she was in was not the room she was actually in. I was trying to help, she said, the same words she had used on the phone, prepared. You also destroyed her portfolio. I kept my voice the same way someone keeps their hands steady on a wheel on ice. Level, deliberate. I took out the photographs, 32 of them, printed 4 to a page on 8 sheets of paper, and set them on the table beside the email. This is where Renata's composure broke its first significant seam. She looked at the photographs, and something moved across her face that was not the smoothness she had come in with. Her hand went to the table beside her plate and pressed flat against it, fingers spread, like she needed to verify the surface. She opened her mouth and closed it, and what came out was not a sentence. It was a sound that started as a word and did not finish. Dolers leaned forward and looked at the photographs. What is this? Camille's art portfolio from her previous school. 32 pieces, built over 2 years, that were in my room at this house the week we were in between apartments. I did not look at Renata when I said the next part. I looked at Dolers. I found them in Renata's room, torn, each one torn separately. I photographed them in her room before I moved them. Dolers leaned back very slowly in her chair. She did not look at Renata. She looked at the photographs for a long moment and then looked at the wall above the window, and I understood that what she was doing was processing something she had not predicted and did not immediately know how to categorize. My mother made a sound, not a word, something low and involuntary. That's not, Renata started. I have photographs of your room, Renata. My voice stayed exactly where it was. The portfolio is in those photographs. The torn pieces are in those photographs. The timeline of when you were in this house and when I found the portfolio is documented. I have all of it. Philip Strand had not moved since I put the first document on the table. He was sitting with his hands folded in front of him and his jaw tight in the specific way of a man who has been blindsided in a social situation and is running the calculation of what association with this moment will cost him. Why would I? Renata tried again, and her voice was different now, higher. The smooth, reasonable register was gone, and what was underneath it was something less controlled. That is the question, I said. I have been asking it since I found them, and I think you know the answer better than I do. She looked at me across the table with the particular expression of someone who has built a version of a situation in their mind and is watching it not match what is happening in the room. Her color had changed. The confidence she had walked in with was somewhere else now. This is a family matter, she said, but it came out like a question. It stopped being a family matter when you went to school and made a false report about an 8-year-old child's behavior. My voice had not risen once. I had been deliberate about that. And it stopped being a family matter when you destroyed her property in a way that was intentional enough to do all 32 pieces individually. Javier said quietly from across the table, Renata, just her name, but the way he said it told her that the room had moved without her. She turned to look at him as if his saying her name was a betrayal, which from her perspective it probably was. He had been neutral for years. His neutrality, quiet and consistent, had probably registered to her as a kind of ambient support. The fact that he had said her name in that tone, with that expression, was the room withdrawing from her. She turned back to me. Her hand was still flat on the table. What do you want, Nora? What is this? I want you to hear what I've already done, I said. The school board has the photographs and the timeline. My attorney has copies of everything. I've documented the behavioral flag and its removal and the origin of the information that caused it. What happens next is not about what I want. It's about what you did and what follows from it. The mention of the attorney landed differently than everything before it. I watched it register in the way a sound registers in a body before the mind has processed it. Renata's hand lifted off the table and then went to her lap. You have an attorney, she said, and it was not a question. I've had an attorney for 3 years. I reached into the folder one more time. Claudia Renner. I first met with her the November before last when Dario and I were separating, but we've talked about other things since then. I set Claudia's letter on the table. It was a one-page summary on letterhead, addressed to Renata by name, stating that her client Nora Scott had documentation of communications made to Greenfield Elementary School prior to Camille Fuentes' enrollment, documentation of the destruction of property belonging to Camille Fuentes, and a recorded 3-year log of related incidents. And that Nora Scott's client was prepared to pursue civil action for intentional destruction of property and tortious interference with the child's educational standing if the matter was not addressed through formal agreement within 30 days. The room after I set that letter down was very still. Not dramatized silence. Just the natural quiet of people who are all processing something at the same time, and none of them have found the other side of it yet. My mother looked at the letter and then she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before or had not seen directed at me. It was not anger. It was the look of someone realizing that their own home, their own gathering, had become the site of something much larger than they had prepared for. She looked at me the way you look at a room you thought you knew well when you find a door in it you did not know was there. Dolores picked up Claudia's letter and went through it. She was the only other person at the table who reached for it. When she finished, she set it down carefully, and she looked at Renata, and she said nothing. That nothing said more than anything else in the room. Philip Strand pushed back from the table, not dramatically, just the movement of a man who has decided he is in the wrong place. Renata? His voice was flat and private. I'm going to wait in the car. She looked at him, and her face did something complicated. There was the version of her expression that was about me and this table, and then there was the separate thing that moved through it when she registered what his sentence meant about them, about the calculation he was making in real time. Her throat moved. He left the room. Nobody tried to stop him. Renata and I were looking at each other. Javier was very still. My mother had both hands around her glass and was looking at the table. Dolores was watching Renata with the careful attention of a woman who has spent a lifetime reading rooms. I did not think it would go this far, Renata said. Her voice was not the voice she had arrived with, it was smaller. The reasonable smoothness was gone, and what remained was something that sounded, to me, close to the truth. I thought if the school was careful with her, if they watched her more closely, she would be fine. I was not trying to hurt her. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, You tore her art, Renata, 32 pieces, one at a time. She had no response to that. Her eyes were bright in a way that was not dignity. She pressed her lips together. You told a principal she had behavioral problems. You did it before she ever set foot in the building. And you did it because we moved, and because moving meant you didn't know where we were anymore, and that felt like something you needed to fix. I was not yelling. I was not crying. I was simply saying what I understood to be true. You have been managing the version of me you needed to exist for 20 years, and I let it happen because it wasn't worth the cost of the fight until it came for my daughter. The room had nothing to add to that. Dolores was very still. Javier was looking at his hands. My mother's face had the particular geography of grief that comes from loving people who have broken something between them that she cannot reach to fix. Renata said nothing for a long time. Then she said quietly, What is she going to do to me? Not what are you going to do? What is she? Claudia. The attorney whose letter was sitting on my mother's lunch table next to photographs of torn paper and a printed email from a school board. I folded my hands. That depends on you. Claudia's letter gives you 30 days. In that time, she needs a written acknowledgement of what happened, a formal letter to the school board correcting the record in your own words, and a replacement of the portfolio. Not the original pieces. Those are documented and filed. A new portfolio, equivalent value, with a written apology to Camille. Renata's expression shifted through several things quickly. The last one it landed on was something deflated and without architecture. The self-positioning she always arrived with, the arrangement of herself in a room, was gone. She looked smaller than she was. And if I do those things, she said, then the civil action doesn't go forward. She looked at the table, then at the letter, then at me. You said you've had her for 3 years. I waited. You were building this for 3 years. I was protecting myself, I said, and Camille. I wasn't building anything against you specifically. You gave me the specific reason. My mother made a sound that was low and tired, and I turned to look at her. Her eyes were wet, not crying, just the particular fullness of eyes that are holding something back. I didn't know, she said, and what she meant was not just that she hadn't known about the school or the portfolio. She meant the accumulated weight of it. The whole picture that the folder and the photographs and the attorney's letter had put in the room. I said, as gently as I could while still meaning it, I know. Dolores reached across the table and covered my mother's hand with her own. She said nothing. She had known my father for 40 years. She had known Renata since Renata was 11. She had the longest memory in the room, and she was the only one who was not surprised in the way the others were surprised. What was in her face was the particular expression of someone watching a thing they had seen coming for a long time finally arrive. Javier looked at me and said, quietly, Good. Just that. Renata heard him. She did not look at him. The lunch was over in every sense that mattered. Renata left 20 minutes later. My mother walked her to the door, and the two of them said something to each other I could not hear from the kitchen. And then my mother came back in and sat down at the table, and the four of us, me, my mother, Dolores, and Javier, sat together in the quiet of a room that had been rearranged. Claudia Renner received Renata's written acknowledgement on the 22nd day of the 30-day window. It was 2 paragraphs. It did not use the word sorry in either of them, but it confirmed the facts as I had stated them and retracted the characterization she had provided to the principal. She also sent a letter to the school board. Dr. Vasquez called me the following week to let me know it had been received and that Camille's file was clean. The replacement portfolio arrived by courier 3 weeks after the lunch. It was a professional art portfolio binder, the kind used in actual art programs, with acid-free sleeves and a high-quality cover. Inside was a gift card to an art supply store in an amount that covered more than the original materials, and a note written on plain paper in Renata's handwriting that said, "I am sorry I hurt your things. That was wrong." It was addressed to Camille. I read it to Camille that evening, sitting on the couch. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Is Aunt Renata in trouble?" I told her that Aunt Renata had done something that needed to be fixed and that she had fixed it and that was what mattered. Camille thought about this. "Is she still mad at us?" I said I didn't think so, not anymore. She nodded and said she wanted the pink-colored pencils from the gift card, the metallic ones, and could we go get them Saturday. We went Saturday. The civil action was not filed. Claudia and I agreed the terms had been met. The documentation, the photographs, the log, the attorney's letter, all of it was retained in Claudia's files. It was not sealed and it was not destroyed. Renata understood this. Philip Strand did not come back after the Saturday lunch. Renata and I have mutual family contacts, and through those contacts, I know that their relationship ended within a month of that afternoon. I do not know what was said between them, and I did not ask. What I know is that the way he left the room before she did said something about what he had seen that he could not unsee. Renata has a different apartment now, on the other side of the city. She and my mother still speak. She and I do not, by mutual non agreement, which is the kind of peace that looks like distance and functions like it too. My mother and I had a long conversation, 3 weeks after the lunch, in her kitchen with the radio off and real coffee, and the particular care of two people who love each other and are trying to understand what they now know about what came before. It was not easy. My mother cried twice. I cried once. We did not resolve everything that had accumulated in the years of small comments and filtered assumptions. But we talked about it honestly for the first time, and that counted for something neither of us had had before. Dolers sent me a card 2 weeks after the lunch. It said, in her handwriting, "Your father would have understood exactly what you did and why." I taped it to the inside of my closet door. Camille finished her first year at the new school on the honor roll for reading. Dr. Vasquez told me at the spring conference that Camille had become one of the more engaged students in the extended enrichment program and had made particular friends with a girl who had a collection of erasers shaped like food. She is, as she has always been, entirely herself. The 529 account is currently at $74,000 and growing. Thomas and I reviewed it last quarter and adjusted the contribution schedule upward. The retirement instruments are doing what instruments built patiently over years are built to do. None of this is something I built against anyone. I built it the way you build anything that matters, without announcing it, without asking permission, and without stopping. I do not hate my sister, but I no longer carry the weight of her version of me. That weight was the thing I had been managing for 20 years without naming it, and putting it on the table, literally, at my mother's lunch, was the moment I stopped. Camille asked me last month, out of nowhere, if I thought Aunt Renata ever looked at the art she made. She meant generally. The new things, the work going into the new portfolio. I told her probably not, but that the work was for her, not for anyone else. She considered this with the seriousness of an 8-year-old processing something real. Then she went back to drawing. That was enough, so did I go too far, or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.